We're just live here, though, right?
Oh, sorry.
What's going on, guys? We are live. We're back again. Have a really exciting interview for you today. He's been on the podcast, I think, 2 times now. This is going to be his third. Dr. Ben Bikman, and I got his book right here. Relatively new. I think it came out last year. It is called Last Summer, Why We Get Sick. How is it going, Dr. Ben?
Yeah. Please call me Ben. Matt, it's going great. Thanks so much. It is always a treat to connect with you guys.
Yeah, so we first saw you at Low Carb Breckenridge. You were doing a talk there. Found you to be very interesting, talking about some stuff that I guess is a little bit different, but is just really interesting. You focus mainly on insulin, and I listened to a few of your talks in preparation for the interview today. And I guess even more, like most people doing keto, they're pretty privy to the idea of insulin regulating weight and being something we should be concerned about. And I would say you have like a whole insulin-centric model of human health. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think well said. Yeah. So people who even consider insulin, anyone who considers insulin outside the scope of glucose is thinking outside the box, because conventional thinking, dogmatic thinking would just equate the two of those, glucose and
Yeah.
insulin, and there's nothing else to discuss.
That's sort of the level one thinking, and that's honestly, that's kind of where I'm at. So maybe you can educate everyone on the next level. We just know glucose goes up, insulin helps with that. That's sort of the dynamic. If you eat a lot of sugar and carbs, your glucose goes up. What else is there to insulin?
Yeah. So that is the most obvious role, where just like you said, someone eats a starchy, sugary meal, blood glucose levels will climb very rapidly. That is a lethal situation, actually, and you can die from what can happen with that chronically elevated glucose because of what's going on at the kidneys. And so insulin comes in from the pancreas into the blood to save the day. It basically opens doors in certain cells throughout the body, like muscle and fat cells, for that glucose to come from the blood into those cells, thereby lowering glucose. And then insulin, having done its job, retreats back into the background. However, that fails to highlight the fact that insulin has an effect on literally every single cell in the body. Every cell in the body has little doors that insulin can come and knock on, and thus tell the cell to do something. The theme of what insulin does, if we tried to distill all of its thousands of chemical reactions to one central idea, is insulin tells cells what to do with energy. Some cells, it tells it to take in energy, like the muscle and the fat cells, but every other cell, it still tells the cell what to do with the energy that it has, what to do with amino acids and glucose and fats and ketones and lactate. It dictates energy use at every cell, and thus, by extension, it dictates energy use in the entire body.
Mm-hmm. So to take a step back, I thought we would first discuss what should we be looking at for just identifying we're healthy? Like what are the indicators? A lot of people, I notice this phenomenon a lot. Like they start doing a keto diet, they're feeling amazing. They seemingly are on their way towards health. And then they go to the doctor and they get like, usually it's a cholesterol test, or they get some kind of number, objective reality fact that the doctor gives them. And that dissuades them from continuing what would have perhaps been a path to health. So is that as simple as it is? Just like there's a few numbers you get from the doctor that tells you you're healthy, or what do you consider someone to be healthy?
Yeah. So there are, importantly, my focus as a scientist on insulin in a condition called insulin resistance, which we can define at any point. That I think is so important. I feel so strongly about it because it is so often overlooked. And I'd mentioned, so with regards to clinical markers, the average individual is coming to their physician visit once a year. And at every single visit, they will get their glucose numbers and then a bunch of lipid numbers, LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. And that'll almost be the end of it. Unfortunately, at no point has the word insulin ever entered into this conversation between patient and clinician. But the tragedy there is that someone could be coming into these doctor appointments year after year over decades, and the glucose is always normal. And so the physician or the clinic is never thinking that there is any hint of a metabolic problem. But in reality, insulin has been climbing steadily throughout every year at every visit. It's just evidence of the person's mounting insulin resistance. They have several times more insulin than they did. It's not working as well in controlling glucose, but they have so much that it works well enough and the glucose is staying in check. And it's only once the body has reached this, if you will, maximal point of insulin resistance, now the glucose starts to climb. And then we detect the problem with conventional thinking because we look at everything through the lens of glucose. So someone could be coming to the doctor and their glucose numbers may look normal, but they're gaining a little weight. Or let's say that their blood pressure is climbing, and blood pressure is one of the most common consequences of hypertension. Or it's a man and he's worried about erectile dysfunction, or the woman is worried about polycystic ovary syndrome, the most common forms of infertility. And those are both very intimately derived from insulin resistance. So their glucose is normal. The physician says, well, you're not really on the spectrum of type 2 diabetes. But if we were to pause that conversation and look at insulin, then we would say, oh, my heavens, your insulin is 5 times higher than it ought to be. That's a red flag. Now, having said all of that, what could someone do if someone had immediate access to their blood lipids or their conventional clinical blood measurements? Glucose won't tell you too much. I would say look at your triglyceride to HDL ratio. Take your triglyceride number, divide it by your HDL cholesterol number, and if that number, if that answer is less than 1.5, that's a very good sign that the person is insulin sensitive and they're doing well and they have a low risk of heart disease. You'd mentioned that sometimes people will adopt a low carb diet. What will very, very, very often happen, triglycerides will plummet, HDL will go up. Those are 2 very, very good changes by any definition. Even dogmatic conventional thinking would say that's a good change. What may happen in some is LDL will stay or go up. And that will commonly be flagged because conventional thinking looks at LDL as this evil that by all means must be expunged and must be pushed down to as low a number as possible. And that is absolutely not true. LDL alone has almost no predictive value when it comes to understanding someone's heart disease risk. And in contrast, there is exceedingly clear evidence that people, as we get older, people with the lowest cholesterol levels die sooner. And then the converse, people with the highest cholesterol live longer. And the lower, especially LDL levels, it increases people's risk of dying from infections by like 15 times. That's a phenomenal increase in risk of serious infections, as well as blood-based cancers like leukemia and lymphoma. So LDL is an extraordinarily protective molecule. It's very much a part of the immune system that's very overlooked, unfortunately. And I'm not saying LDL has no relevance to health, but I am saying to look at LDL alone simply gives you almost no real value. If someone is adopting a low carbohydrate diet and they really want to get a feel for what their blood lipids can tell them, look at the triglyceride to HDL ratio, and I guarantee it will start to go down with the adoption of a low carb diet. As insulin comes down, those blood lipids get better.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense for sure. So if you're doing your checkups and you're saying that the glucose, which is what a lot of people get alarmed, I think you do a fasting glucose check usually, and pre-diabetes is like 107 or something in that range. So I was going to ask, does that seem like it's actually a good metric to go by? But you're saying that once you get that, we're like way behind the 8 ball to begin with, right?
Oh, yeah, certainly. By the time someone's noticing their glucose levels creeping up into the low hundreds, 100 teens, et cetera, it's extraordinarily likely that they have been fighting this battle of insulin resistance. In other words, elevated insulin for 10 to 20 years. Now, Matt, there are some within the low carb community who come into a low carb diet with reasonably normal glucose levels. Maybe they've been hovering in the 90s every morning in a fasted state, and they see it start to climb up or not go down. There's this paradoxical rise in glucose. There is no good answer for why that happens, but we are just about to start a study from my lab, sponsored actually by this group called Levels Health. They make these continuous glucose monitors. They are funding the experiments, but we're going to try to get an idea of and characterize why this happens in some people and why other people, most people have the expected drop in glucose.
Okay. What about something like the A1C test? Is that better? That's good.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So A1C is typically, we define it as a longer view of glucose. And on one hand, that's correct. It would give you an idea of what the glucose levels are as they're binding to red blood cells. But what is so overlooked is that there's another variable to this, which is the lifespan of the red blood cell. And what I mean by that is if someone has red blood cells that live 20 to 30 days longer than someone else might have. So if someone has long-lived red blood cells,
what dictates that?
Yeah, well, I don't know. It could be iron status. It could be physical activity, menstrual cycle, seriousness. So a few variables would come into it. Nutrition would absolutely be a part of it, though. Someone with long-lived red blood cells may have a false positive when it comes to their HbA1c, just because if a red blood cell is living a lot longer, it just stands to reason that it's going to get glycosylated more. It will be more likely to get glycosylated or have a glucose bind it. That's not inherently pathogenic. The red blood cell can still function. In contrast, so that person may have long-lived red blood cells and have perfectly normal glucose levels, and yet their HbA1c appears to be artificially high. In contrast, someone could have very short-lived red blood cells because of poor nutrition, for example, and have high glucose levels. But because the red blood cells have such a short lifespan, they're dying so readily that we get this false negative where it looks like their HbA1c is fine, when in reality there is a problem. It's just their short-lived red blood cells are masking it.
Okay. So when we get all of these tests sort of in combination, it seems like you can get a little bit of a picture of some things that are going on. But is there a better way? Like, what's the earliest way to identify chronically high insulin?
Yeah, well, the best way would be to convince your clinician to measure insulin. If someone could go in for their next appointment and just say, I really want my insulin measured as a part of this blood panel that you're measuring, you're getting glucose, you're getting lipids, maybe they're getting a few other hormones, to do like a thyroid check or et cetera. Say, could you please just check that insulin box and measure my insulin levels? Very, very often it can be done and insurance will cover it. It's just even physicians, the average physician just simply won't think about it, let alone the patient. So the patient needs to be very, politely aggressive and saying, please check that box. And if a person does have their insulin levels, and this is in the US, so the kind of US units here, if your fasting insulin is 6 microunits per mil or under, that's awesome. That's an extremely good sign that you're very insulin sensitive. If it's up into the teens, kind of high teens, that's a warning sign. There might be a problem. And then if it's into the 20s and beyond, I would say that's almost definitely a problem. I give that little wiggle room into the teens because insulin, like every hormone, has its own rhythm where it will ebb and flow. And it's possible someone catches it at a high point, putting them, let's say, into the high teens. But then all the more reason to look at that insulin level and temper or balance it out by looking at the triglyceride to HDL ratio, which I mentioned earlier. If that ratio is less than 1.5 and your insulin is, say, 15, I would say the insulin's higher than you'd like, but we likely, if your triglyceride to HDL ratio is 1, which is great, we very likely just caught your insulin at a peak and it's actually good.
Okay. And then something you've been talking about, I think more recently, is the insulin as a therapy to combat high glucose. And a lot of people are kind of in this situation. And I know that you go into sort of the downsides and the unintended consequences of using insulin therapy, like supplemental insulin to combat high blood glucose and type 2 diabetes, things like that. So a lot of people are put in that situation where they go to the doctor they have a blood glucose of like 110 or something, fasting glucose, and they're prescribed insulin. And it seems like, obviously I don't want to be taking this insulin, but maybe I just need to. It's what's good for me in the short term while I fix my diet and stuff. So how do you approach something like that, like a 110 or a 110 glucose reading at the doctor's office?
Yeah. So from what I understand, I think a typical course of treatment would be that the person progressing towards type 2 diabetes would be coming in and their glucose levels are into the higher kind of mid hundreds perhaps, or maybe not even that high. And they would be given a therapy like metformin as a first step. And then, like all drugs, that has diminishing returns. And if still with metformin, insulin is staying into the hundreds, then it would be something like, all right, let's progress to insulin. And insulin works. And let me elaborate. So the paradigm was, as I outlined, where a person has been living a life of elevated insulin, and now the glucose starts to climb. And because we look at type 2 diabetes as a glucose-centric problem, the average clinician will say, well, I don't care what the insulin levels are. I don't even know what insulin levels are. Let's just put you on insulin therapy. Now we're going to push your insulin to a super physiological level, and it works at lowering the glucose. Glucose comes down, and because that is the clinical metric of interest, that would be considered a success. But the great tragedy in that paradigm is the person is already swimming in a sea of insulin, and not to get into a different topic, but the chronically elevated insulin is a large contributor to the insulin resistance in the first place. So I use this analogy, and you've undoubtedly heard me use it before. Giving a type 2 diabetic insulin and hoping it will treat their problem is like giving an alcoholic another glass of wine. In both instances, you're giving them more of the very thing that's causing the problem. So in type 2 diabetes, which at its foundation is a disease of insulin resistance, which is almost in very large part caused by the chronically elevated insulin itself, by dumping more insulin into the system, and this is what happens, we make the type 2 diabetic fatter and sicker. And this has been measured. There is no clinical outcome that is favorably impacted by giving a type 2 diabetic insulin other than you lower their glucose. But we lower their glucose levels, but they get fatter and they get sicker. The more aggressively a type 2 diabetic is using insulin to treat their glucose or to lower their glucose, they have significant, like multiples, 2 or 3 times higher risk of dying from heart disease, cancer, and Alzheimer's disease, let alone gaining 20 pounds over 6 months, over the ensuing 6 months of insulin therapy. So giving a type 2 diabetic insulin is a wonderful way to make them fat and sick and kill them faster. There's just no other way to say it.
I don't understand. Why are we still doing it then?
Yeah, I know. Well, I think we have to, in my more compassionate moments, which being a father helps me have more often than I used to, of course, but I'm inclined to see things from the perspective that would make it a little forgivable, which is to say, historically, glucose was the most obvious cause of the problem. You know, historically, someone with diabetes, which that word means the excessive production of urine, that excessive urine production was directly a result of the elevated glucose. It's spilling into, we have so much urine, so much glucose in the blood that the kidneys can't keep it all in the blood. So they start leaking the glucose, and that is pulling water from the blood with it. And so then the person's urinating a lot. That is what the term diabetes comes from. And again, that is directly a result of the glucose. And it's scientifically easier to measure glucose than it is to measure insulin. But my view is that our ongoing obsession with glucose at the expense of insulin is becoming increasingly less forgivable as we are getting more informed and as measuring insulin is becoming easier and easier.
Well, it seems like this is similar. We do this a lot, right? Like we find a number that we can hone in on. We can develop treatments that just specialize in adjusting that number. And then we just do that. It's the same with like statin drugs. It lowers your cholesterol. But the unintended consequences, like the level 2 thinking, what does this new thing, does it present new problems? It always does. Sometimes sometimes the rewards outweigh the risks. A lot of the times it doesn't though. So
well said. I agree 100%.
Yeah. We do have some questions in chat. This seems like a good one. please ask if insulin effect is additive. For example, I eat 100 grams of bread or 100 grams of bread plus butter. The total insulin release, like area under the curve, which one's better?
Ah, that's a great question. Um, Insulin, the addition of fat will have, I would say, very little effect. And I don't think it will. If it increased the insulin, it would be very, very modest, if at all. However, indeed, it may even blunt the insulin response somewhat. However, I would not want someone to think that that's going to be better. I'm very much an advocate of scrutinizing insulin, but that would be a net negative effect. Adding fat to refined starches, that is not a good mix. Well, it's a delicious mix, but it is a mix that is it's tricky for the body because you have that insulin spike from the bread. The butter alone will have no insulin effect, but the fact that you now have an insulin effect from that starch and it's coming with fat, that's just a feast for the fat cells because insulin is activating the uptake of fat into the fat cells. That's the most prominent way whereby fat cells get bigger once they're already of a certain size. And so you're making your fat cells just sort of have the best day ever. So if you're going to eat that piece of bread, I'd say it'd be better. I hate to say this, but I think it would be better to eat it alone or not eat it at all.
Yeah, and then I think another question people have similar to this is what about like added fiber instead of the added fat? Does fiber, because I've heard both, like fat blunts the insulin response, same with fiber. Is either of those true?
Oh yeah, both. Yeah, the fiber does. There's no question about that. I don't mean to sound like I'm stumping for fiber at all, but there's no question. Soluble fiber in particular has a very good effect on glycemic and even insulin responses to foods.
Okay, and then we got a question about like, I guess alarmingly low glucose levels on a keto diet, say like lower than 70, even lower than 60. Like, what do you make of that?
Yeah, yeah. So some people just seem to run low. And my thought is when I'm talking to someone who sees that their morning glucose levels are in the 60s or so, which would be considered low, I ask them, or even in the 50s, I just ask them, how do you feel? And if they feel fine, they don't feel tired or have a headache or they're shaky or lethargic, then my view is then there's no reason to worry about it. In fact, there was studies by George Cahill, a legendary physiologist who studied fasting and starvation, and he had people that were kind of keto adapted, if you will, through fasting, and he gave them insulin injections during these fasted states to lower their glucose down to like 20 milligrams per deciliter, and they were fine. I think it's because these were people who were adjusted or adapted to using ketones. And so even the glucose, even though it went very, very low, and I would say that is dangerously low, their brain was so adapted to using ketones for a fuel that they didn't appear to suffer any deficits. Now, again, I'm not encouraging that intervention at all, but my point being that if someone has adapted to ketones as a fuel for their brain, in other words, they've been adhering to a low carb diet for several weeks, if someone is finding that their glucose levels are lower than expected, I wouldn't be surprised if they feel fine, in which case I would say there's nothing to do.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And then how about like post-meal glucose levels? Like say someone's trying to self-diagnose, they have their glucose meter at home, just trying to kind of hone in on what truly your glucose is doing. Like fasting is what you get at the doctor's office. I know a lot of times with type 2 diabetics or pre-diabetics, they have you do the postprandial glucose readings. What would you say over the course of a week is like a good protocol to kind of diagnose where your glucose levels are?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so in fact, indeed, with the rise of the continuous glucose monitors that people are able to get their hands on, indeed, I have mine on right now that I get from Levels. These are things people can start to do at home. So if someone takes like 2 pieces of bread and they find that their 2-hour, would that be the range? Yeah, probably. Around if their 2-hour glucose levels are still haven't No, probably be around 3 hours. By around 3 hours, the glucose should be back to normal. And if around 2 hours it's not down back under around 120 or so, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason to think that you're very likely insulin resistant, slash glucose intolerant, where, in other words, you're not clearing that glucose particularly well, likely due to a degree of insulin resistance at the muscles. So within around 3 hours, it should be back to normal. At around maybe halfway through that, 60, 90 minutes, actually, you don't want to see it get above 200. If it gets above 200, that's a problem.
Okay. And how about, like, I know I think this is true. There's some level of, like, if you're doing a keto diet for a while, like particularly Mega, my wife, when she was pregnant, they do a gestational diabetes type of glucose tolerance test.
Yes.
And we just did an option you can do is at-home testing, where you just actually test your glucose consistently. You like log it on a sheet. We did that instead of taking I think it's 50 grams of glucose or something. It's kind of a lot. So we opted to not do that. But my thought would be someone doing a keto diet for an extended period of time would probably fare worse on that type of a test than someone who's consistently having, 200 or 300 grams of carbs a day. I don't know. What do you think about that? Like, how do we approach that?
Yeah, I'm thrilled you brought this up. So Matt, I think that I'm not to make it sound like I think I'm too clever. My wife makes sure I never have that much of an ego, but I do think I coined a term, this reverse metabolic inflexibility. And by that, let me elaborate very briefly.
I like that.
When someone's been adhering to a chronically high carbohydrate diet, their insulin levels are always elevated. And insulin, as I mentioned earlier, insulin dictates fuel use. The primary fuels in the body are glucose, or blood sugar, and fats. Those are the two fuels. You're a sugar burning or you're fat burning at any moment and to various degrees. Insulin is what dictates which fuel you're burning. And because most people have chronically elevated insulin, they're stuck in sugar burning mode. So even when they've entered what would be considered a fasting phase, 4 hours after a meal, they're still burning sugar at a higher rate than fat. That is not supposed to happen. We're supposed to be sugar burning after a meal, and a few hours after the meal, we get into fat burning. So we're flexible. We're moving between the two. So most people are metabolically inflexible these days. They're stuck in sugar burning mode, and thus good luck losing weight because you never get into fat burning mode. Now, however, I think there's something to be said for strict long-term adherence to a low carbohydrate diet. In this situation, a person has had such low levels of insulin that they are, in a way, stuck in fat burning mode. They just turned off the sugar burning mode processes. Like, for example, in the muscle is thinking, I can burn sugar or I can burn fat. I've turned off my sugar burning mechanism so that I can give more of that glucose to the brain, although the brain is using ketones. But there are other cells like red blood cells. Red blood cells have no option. They have to use glucose. And so the body just starts sort of sparing. It gets more sparing in its burning of glucose and rather in favor of burning fat. Now, I would say that's a healthy situation. A person can thrive and live a perfectly long, healthy life in this state. But nevertheless, when you suddenly load the system with glucose, like you have someone adhering to a ketogenic diet, they go in for an oral glucose tolerance test and they drink 50 grams of glucose, the body is suddenly flush with glucose. And now it's sort of panicking, if you will, to try to ramp up the sugar burning mechanisms again, which they had previously somewhat kind of turned off. And so the person will get this, what I would consider an artificially elevated response to that oral glucose tolerance test. But it's not because they've become diabetic. I would argue it's not because they've become insulin resistant, though some people like to use the term physiological insulin resistance in this state. I disagree with that terminology completely and happy to elaborate. But the body has really just become metabolically inflexible in favor of fat over glucose. The body has simply stopped burning glucose. But if you give this person an injection of insulin in a low carb state, the insulin works perfectly fine. So they're not insulin resistant. They've just become somewhat glucose intolerant. So that's a reverse metabolic inflexibility. So if someone has to go in and play that clinical game, they need to take an oral glucose tolerance test. I would say you should, in the preceding days, start eating some more carbs. Just get the body back to that actual flexibility of burning fats really well, and then when needed, burning sugars really well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So is metabolic flexibility something to strive for? It seems like a lot of people say it is. It makes sense to me that it would be. What is your thought on that? That being the
Yeah.
idea, like you don't want to go too far towards just like long-term super low carb, and the other end of the spectrum is standard American diet, very high carb. You want to be, I think it makes sense to probably be more towards the low carb, especially relative to what we do these days. But can you go too far? Is that bad? Just strict keto for
So
years and years?
I don't think it's bad. And I say that just because we know there are people who do that, like individuals who actually adhere to very, very strict ketogenic diets in order to control their epilepsy. For example, I know people who adhere to it in order to control migraines, where the moment they get off a ketogenic diet, they get really debilitating migraine headaches. And I know of no negative consequences in these people. So I would say you can certainly adhere to a strict ketogenic diet long term. And if you do have that reverse metabolic inflexibility, it doesn't matter because you're doing it in a state of low insulin. And that low insulin is going to keep you healthy and lean at the risk of oversimplifying disease. However, for the rest of us that adhere to a low carb diet to just be lean and healthy, my priority is to be a healthy, involved dad. And someday, to be a healthy, involved grandpa. I'm kind of thinking long term. I want that. I want to be that kind of grandpa. That's why I adhere to a low carb diet. But I also live in a family and we have carbohydrates around. And so I think I end up adhering to what some would call a cyclical ketogenic diet, not because I feel a compulsion to sprinkle in carbs. It's just the practical way of doing it for me in my home, where I am very, very strict with every breakfast for myself. I'm very strict with every lunch for myself. And at dinner, depending on what the family is eating for dinner, I will be a little more liberal with carbohydrates. The fact that it keeps me a little more metabolically, genuinely flexible, shifting between the fuels, that's nice, but that doesn't worry me necessarily. However, maybe having said all of this, the person who's adhering to a very strict ketogenic diet and then they have one horrific cheat day or cheat meal, I do think that can have negative consequences. And there was a scientist at University of British Columbia who published a paper finding that with adherence to a ketogenic diet, if you dose with the person with a large starch meal, you do get a much greater degree of vascular damage. And that could be a result of this inverse metabolic flexibility. You're spending the whole week really, really becoming an excellent fat burner. And then you just wreak metabolic hell in the body for that moment, for those hours or that day. Mm-hmm. There might be, I'm not sure. I guess I don't really want to be an advocate of one way over the other. I'd say you either really kind of go all in and you're never really eating carbs again, or you're just very smart about it, where you have a little bit at dinner, every day, for example, or something like that. Where for me, like last night, we had salmon and asparagus and broccoli. I had no problem. I ate as much broccoli and asparagus as I wanted with that salmon. And I couldn't care less. Of course, those are very good low starch vegetables anyway, but it's certainly going to help my body remember how to sugar burn when needed.
Mm-hmm. So as far as some people are asking about like the healthy carbs to eat, you don't want to eat grains, they're saying. So I recall, I think you have a few talks on like fructose. A lot of people are very anti-fructose, which is obviously like mostly in fruits. So what do we eat if we want to do 100 grams of carbs, let's say?
Yeah. So in fact, all the more reason to point the finger at fructose. A paper was just published last week, which took people. This was a randomized double-blind controlled trial. So it is powerful in that regard, and its conclusions can be looked at as very authoritative. They took people with diagnosed confirmed fatty liver disease, the most common liver problem, and the only intervention was to have one group eating less fructose, and they had much more substantial, significant improvements in fatty liver disease. So I do think we ought to be scrutinizing insulin. And I would say never drink your fruits, eat them. Don't drink fruit, eat it. Yeah. And when I talk about low carb diets, I think you're kind of invoking these terms, which I really like. It's sort of first order thinking or second order thinking. First order, my sentiment is always whatever the carbs are, let them be fruits and vegetables. That's sort of and done. Those are your carbs. And the next order thinking would progress to vegetables that grow above the ground and avoiding the tropical fruits, pineapples, mangoes, these more sugary fruits. And I guess maybe at that same order of thinking, it's really to focus on the least sugary fruits like berries, and I think citrus would qualify as well. Those are the nice ones. But I don't think most people need to go there. I think if they're staying even at that first level, which is if you're focusing on getting around 100 grams of carbohydrate, if they're coming from whole fruits and vegetables, I think the person almost always is going to be pretty well off.
Mm-hmm. And then a couple of people asking about glucagon, which is something I wasn't too aware of until this is the actual talk you did in Low Carb Breckenridge, I remember a few years ago. So yep. I don't know a ton about it, but you kind of presented it as like some sort of a counterparty to insulin, something you want to strive for potentially in the way of eating more protein was kind of the way I remember it. But if you want to elaborate further on glucagon.
Yeah, well, Matt, that's A plus for you. You're a good student. You remember that. You remember that lecture. Yeah. So I brought up glucagon. I think, Matt, not to let my ego get too big. I think I'm the first one in the low carb community who really shined the spotlight on glucagon. I felt it was necessary to help alleviate people's concerns with protein. So at that point, I had only been exposed to the low carb community at large for, a little over a year. I was really totally unaware until the Jeff Gerber at Low Carb Denver reached out to me to give that first talk the year prior to that. What I had seen in the low carb community was people thinking that drinking MCT oil was a meal. And I was just struck by how bizarre that was, that was their meal. I'm drinking coffee with MCT oil and that's what I have for my meal. And I thought that's unnatural a bit. Because
does MCT oil even make sense? I've been thinking a little bit more about it. It's kind of weird to me now. Well, MCT oil is burned more readily than long chain fats, like the fats you get from butter. Although I would much rather someone drink butter. There's so much more nutritional value in butter than there is in just, C8 of an MCT. MCT is burned more readily than the long chain fats in the body, which makes it more ketogenic. But I don't think that's a reason to be drinking it. I would say if someone wants to add fat to their coffee, for example, just to make it a little, to get a little more satiety, to kind of fast through breakfast, I would say go with butter or even coconut oil, which has a broader spectrum of fats than just pure MCT oil. I'm reluctant to deviate too far away from nature these days, more and more. That's sort of a conclusion I've come to. So drinking like 14 grams of MCT oil, who did that in the past? It's sort of a foreign
people
thing.
Who want to just be people who want to be running to the toilet like 2 hours later. Yeah. So that's kind of to my point though, Matt, is that I sensed there was something unnatural about just drinking oil. And I hear people saying, well, don't eat too much protein. It'll kick you out of ketosis. And that was the impetus for that talk, which was putting protein in context. There is, without a doubt, protein has an insulinogenic effect. There is an insulin response to protein. When you eat that protein with fat, however, it is blunted. You've mitigated that somewhat. So all the more reason to eat that protein with fat, as nature always has the two come together, always. Well, unless it's a fruit oil like avocados or olives, which is fine. Those are fine. But focus on that protein and fat. And in the context of a low carbohydrate diet, the insulin response to that protein is significantly less than it is if you're eating protein in the context of a high carbohydrate diet. And then to bring in this new character, glucagon will act somewhat as the opposite. It's the yin and the yang of metabolic regulation. What insulin is telling a cell to do, glucagon is commonly telling the cell to do the opposite. And so what happens in a low carbohydrate diet with the consumption of protein, you do get a modest insulin effect, but it is matched by an equal or greater glucagon effect. And so I introduced this concept, newly introduced, although it's an old idea, of the insulin to glucagon ratio, in that where that ratio is staying similar to a fasting level, then don't worry about what it's going to do to your ketones, or don't worry about what insulin is going to do at the fat cell, because glucagon is there to keep insulin's effects in check. It's there to counter insulin. And so that was the gist of it. So glucagon is a hormone that stimulates ketogenesis. It stimulates lipolysis. It does all these things that we want within reason, of course, but it's just acting as a balance.
Yeah. What causes it to rise?
Yeah. Typically the most potent stimulus is the opposite of what insulin's stimulus is. Insulin is stimulated with elevated glucose. Glucagon is stimulated by low glucose. So anyone who's adhering to a low carb diet or fasting, their glucagon levels will absolutely be elevated. And that's necessary. It's helping the body mobilize energy, including the breakdown of glucose from the liver and the production of new glucose, activating gluconeogenesis.
Okay, so kind of practical application of all this stuff then. Particularly, I'm thinking about the people who they're already seeing like their glucose readings elevated a little bit. They're in sort of the danger zone of starting to be prescribed some stuff. And especially, I guess we haven't even talked about the people that are currently on insulin. Yeah, I guess let's go to that. Like, where do you go from there? You're having to continually, I guess, monthly, or I guess I don't really know how insulin works, but I know you need ever higher doses to get the same effect, as with most things in the human body. So where do you go from there as far as just diet interventions? How do we get off insulin? What do we do?
Yeah. So Matt, I believe that there are 3 simple rules, and I use alliteration just to facilitate learning and memory because I'm a professor. Control carbohydrates, and we've talked about that now. Focus on the least starchy, least sugary carbohydrates like fruits and vegetables. Number 2, prioritize protein. Make sure you're eating enough protein and you're getting from the best sources, namely animal proteins. And I'll pause on that point for just a moment to elaborate. Nowadays, we are inundated with plant proteins. You walk through a grocery store, I walk through Costco, and some of the first pallets I see are these plant-based proteins. They are everywhere. We are obsessed with plant-based proteins, and that is to our detriment. Anyone listening who's flirting with plant-based proteins, stop wasting your money.
So in your mind, real quickly, what's the major differences there? Animal versus plant protein?
Yeah, I'm happy to elaborate. In fact, I can't help myself because I'm so opposed to it on principle. Not only do plant proteins not have as good of an amino acid profile, so you're going to not be getting the balance of amino acids that you need, but you also don't absorb them as well. So it's another level of you not getting the nourishment you think you are. And this is quantified in humans. We know in humans that the best proteins are egg, meat, and dairy. Any plant protein is far below that. Part of the problem with plant proteins is that every plant protein contains things called anti-nutrients. I'm not making that up. It seems like it's a mythical term. It's not. Every plant protein ends up getting enriched in these molecules that inhibit the digestion of the protein from that plant. And these are things like phytic acids, tannins, trypsin inhibitors. I invite anyone to after this discussion to go look these up. All plant proteins have these. So it's
you'll see the vegan protein powders. They have like the enzymes in there already to help digest the proteins.
Yeah, they have to try to overcome what the plant is trying to do, which is stop you from eating it. And so don't eat me because you're not going to get any nutritional value. And then second, what is overlooked, but this was confirmed by a group called the Clean Label Project, plant proteins contain heavy metals like lead and arsenic. And this is a consequence of doing something that is a little unnatural. I hate to sound like a hippie, but for example, peas are incredibly deficient in protein. If you're trying to get a serving of protein from peas, you've got to take 1,000 peas and refine it in order to get that protein. In the process of concentrating these peas, the protein is what you want. What you don't want is the minerals that are naturally enriched in peas. When you eat a handful of peas, it's an insignificant amount. But when you've concentrated 1,000 peas, now you're getting potentially unhealthy levels of lead and arsenic. And this is what this Clean Label Project, this third-party group, confirmed in plant proteins. You just don't get those in animal proteins. The magic of the animal is that those sorts of things have been worked out through the animal in different mechanisms. So focus on on animal protein. Make sure you're getting enough of it. And I would add to that, introducing the third and final rule in my mind, is don't fear fat. Protein and fat come together in nature. Eat fat. And not only does fat help the protein digest better, it does. When someone eats fat with protein, the digestive mechanisms of digesting fat, the bile acids, actually help digest. It improves the breakdown of the protein as well. So people will commonly say, I can't eat a whey shake or something, it upsets my stomach. And I will always say, well, what if you mix that whey with some fat? And I believe a 1-to-1 ratio of fat to protein is what's ideal in that regard. And almost always the person finds that they handle the protein just fine. So fat helps the protein to digest better. Fat and protein together are more anabolic than protein alone. That's also confirmed in humans. And also the magic of fat is that fat has no insulin effect. And so when you look at human health through the lens that I do, which is how can I keep my insulin low while nourishing my body to live a long, healthy, lean life, then fat is valuable. Don't fear fat. But I would also say don't focus on fat alone. Like we'd said earlier, the idea, if our ancestors looked at us drinking even a cup of olive oil, or sprinkling olive oil or coconut oil into a drink, they would think we're bizarre. I would just say don't fear being liberal with fat when you're adding it to your protein, especially if someone's eating a lean meat like chicken, you put some butter or some olive oil on that. Fat and protein are supposed to come together. So those are the rules. Control carbs, prioritize protein, don't fear fat.
Yeah, those are really good rules. I do this a lot now. I just think of like what we would have eaten in the past. And when you really think about it, like game animals, they're quite lean to begin with. But then you also look at some people's, like the Inuit, they would have 80% calories from fat. They would just eat a lot of like seals and stuff. So really high fat animals. And it seems like we can thrive on a lot of different diets, even high carb diets if you're like living near the equator. It's really just, I guess I think of things more in the context of like, we've grown up, at least me, probably your generation as well. We're the same generation generally, but the environment we grew up in, it's not just like, you can't just think about what's natural at this point because it's so unnatural, the environment we grew up in. We're
so far removed.
Yeah, you have to have some sort of antidote. And to me, doing keto to begin with, at the very least, like that puts the ball back in your court a little bit. You have more control over your hunger. You're just off the blood sugar roller coaster. And from there, you can then maybe attack something slightly different, still obviously under the spectrum of ancestral diets. But that's what makes sense to me. I think keto has a place just to get you off. Like right now for the start of the year, we're doing the 30 under 20 challenge, which is the first 30 days of the year under 20 grams of net carbs, not counting calories, ideally not weighing yourself. But that's the thing people have the hardest time with, is weighing themselves every single day. And I think that just sets you up to make better decisions down the road, because I know me, I don't know if you have a lot of experience with just like calorie counting as an approach to dieting. No?
Oh, I think it's terrible.
Oh, okay. But you personally, have you done it before?
No, never. Maybe as an assignment as an undergraduate or something in a nutrition class. But I rage against that kind of tedium.
I am more and more now lately, because I realize because it's so common sense. It's not actual common sense, but it's like a modern version of common sense where it makes total sense. You just eat less and you end up losing weight. Not thinking about the long-term consequences, the adherence to things. So yeah, this stuff makes a lot of sense for sure. But just kind of winding down here, I've kept you for a while. We got the book, Why We Get Sick, and what can people expect to learn about in this book? Kind of a lot of the stuff we talked about today.
Oh yeah, certainly. Some of the things we touched on today, just in much greater detail. But lest someone think that's daunting or going to be boring, I do think it's an easy to read book, but it really just helps us point the finger at what I deeply believe is the true culprit when it comes to chronic disease that is so overlooked. Hence the reason for the book, which is basically, what is insulin resistance? Why does it matter? and what to do about it. And the why does it matter part is pretty enlightening for many people. When you look at the degree, and I, of course, cite hundreds of studies to support this, when you look at the degree to which insulin resistance underlies almost every chronic disease, it helps you point the finger at one single problem rather than having the daunting task of treating every disorder as a separate entity. For example, my hope at the end of reading that book, a guy would open up his medicine cabinet and look at the medications, and he realizes, I'm taking a medication for my diabetes, I'm taking a medication for my hypertension, I'm taking a medication for my erectile dysfunction and for my migraine headaches. All of that is completely possible. I'm sure many people that are just getting on to Keto Connect and going to do this challenge with you guys, they would be nodding their heads, at least to some degree, thinking of all the medications they're taking. Every one of those four medication or four disorders I just mentioned, where the guy's taking separate medications to treat, every one of them has a profoundly relevant connection to insulin resistance. And so the person would read the book, and in my mind, I would imagine he starts to challenge this idea that they're each separate disorders and say, well, to varying degrees, they're all coming from insulin resistance. And then the next question would be, how can I improve my insulin resistance? That is not going to be based on a drug. If you want to improve your insulin resistance, it is a lifestyle disease. The diet, the food that we eat, is either the culprit or the cure. It's that food that got you where you are, and it's a different type of food that's going to get you back to where you want to get, improving your insulin resistance, and honestly, eventually, in those instances of those four medications, possibly getting off of every one of them.
Yeah. So what do you make of the idea? I interviewed Gary Taubes last week, and I guess I'm starting to put things sort of on the spectrum of like hormone absolutist, which I would say you're more in that direction. And then you have like the calorie guys on the other end. Right. And I think the calorie guys would say what you're saying is basically keep insulin low, the weight comes off, everything sort of self-corrects from there. The calorie people would say, you count calories, reduce your calories, you lose the weight, the insulin takes care of itself. Sort of like a reverse of your process. Yeah. What's wrong with that way? Yeah,
well, nothing is wrong with either. So I very much appreciate what you're saying. I never, my views are that there's a combination here. Without a doubt, we have to account for energy. And for heaven's sakes, I appreciate that as well or more than most. My PhD was bioenergetics, which is the actual use of energy in living organisms. So calories matter, but I also think there's something absolutely foolish, if not totally ignorant, in attempting to fit a biological model into the perfect binary view of thermodynamics in the realm of physics. Mm-hmm. I think that is wrong. And to look at protein, for example, and say protein is 4 calories per gram, that's the same as a carbohydrate. BS. It's not comparable.
Do you have any like convincing studies and stuff that kind of back this point up? Because I know the calorie people will point to like controlled feeding studies where macros are adjusted, weight loss kind of ends up being the same. So you would think...
Yeah. Yeah. So there are going to be two sets of data, and they both exist, like randomized clinical trials in perfectly controlled ward studies, metabolic ward. There are some that show no difference, and there are some that do show an improvement with low carb, even calories controlled. Now, mind you, unfortunately, there are some people who will find these findings of like couple of the studies by Kevin Hall, who I think is a great researcher. He will overlook or underrepresent some of his own data. Like, for example, his finding that the adherence to a ketogenic diet had a significantly higher metabolic rate. Well, then if it's all about calories, well, that matters then. Mm-hmm. So my view is we need to appreciate both. There's without a doubt in organisms, hormones play a part. It is physically impossible for a fat cell to get big unless insulin is elevated. Now, of course, you must have sufficient calories to fuel that fat cell growth. So calories matter as well. But in contrast, if insulin is low, there is no choice but fat cells to shrink. And one of the most obvious examples is type 1 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, a person can be eating 4,000 calories per day, and they may be excreting 500 of it as glucose from the urine, but that in no way accounts for all the calories they cannot get fat. And in contrast, they cannot stay fat, which is why type 1 diabetics learn early on, unfortunately, that they can eat anything they want. And if they deliberately underdose their insulin, they will stay as skinny as they want. Now, it's not healthy. It's not healthy at all in that instance, but they've learned that insulin is the absolute controller of fat cell growth or shrinking, one way or the other. It has its hand on that lever. But again, if insulin is trying to stimulate a fat cell to grow, you have to have sufficient energy to be pulling into that fat cell to feed that fat cell growth. So my view, some people will look at me and say, Ben is an insulin guy. He's an endocrine theory of obesity, and he has no regard for calories. Not true. I just simply say it's not just calories. We have to consider the insulin. But because that view is still so counterintuitive and challenges the dogmatic view that it is purely calories, I end up saying that side louder. And so it seems like I'm just an insulin guy, when in reality, I realize that energy must be accounted for, but attempting to perfectly balance calories, you're doomed, because it fails to acknowledge the nuances of eating food. Like, protein has such a high thermic effect of eating it that giving it a comparable caloric value to glucose is asinine. It's absolutely ridiculous. In contrast, if insulin levels are elevated, that physically slows metabolic rate. In contrast, if insulin levels are low, metabolic rate accelerates. And this can shift by as much as 300 calories per day, as David Ludwig published about 2 years ago from Harvard. So even then, it's insulin just playing within the realm of calories. It's just, like I said, insulin tells the body what to do with energy, not that it's creating it or destroying it without, with wanton abandon. No, that energy must be accounted for. It's just that we cannot, in the average individual, account for all calorie, what it does when we eat it, as well as what's happening when we expend it. A person may change their diet and their metabolic rate changes. That is confirmed. Or alternatively, they're in ketosis, and now they're breathing out ketones and urinating out ketones. Every ketone is a piece of fat that, in this instance, didn't have to be burned as energy going up or exercising. They just simply wasted it from the body. And how is the average person attempting to track that wasted energy? So but insulin controls that too, frankly. So to look at human weight regulation and to ignore insulin is, I think, unfortunate. So maybe to wrap that up, I would say someone who is looking at Keto Connect and wanting to make a diet change, I think there's tremendous value in doing exactly what you said. Don't count your calories, just focus on your macros. That is without a doubt going to bump you down a significant amount of weight. Once you've come to that new plateau, if you're not where you think you should be, then it's perhaps time to start scrutinizing calorie number. But that, to me, is not that's not the place to start. Because if you start a dietary intervention with hunger, which is what calorie counting is going to lead to, at least initially, you're doomed. Hunger will always win. So become a fat burner, start to rely on your own fat for fuel, and you're going to be less hungry. You'll naturally start controlling your appetite better. You'll get to a level, and then next level, start looking at your calorie number.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm on board with that fully. And then I was watching a couple of your presentations. The one other thing that stood out to me as being pretty crazy is I think you were talking about people with taking insulin therapy. They would actually gain weight and slow metabolism, which is like not a common thing at all. Usually when you're gaining weight, your metabolism is going up.
That's right. Yeah, and that's because insulin slows metabolic rate.
And I also think you mentioned, was there a study on healthy individuals that they supplemented insulin, and what happened?
So there's a study where they gave these young, healthy males insulin infusions, and they just became demonstrably insulin resistant within just hours, or, after the end, like 12 hours or so. Yeah. And that was just evidence of one of the key causes of insulin resistance, which is insulin itself, chronically elevated insulin. But yeah, you can put we did this study here in my lab in rodents. When we artificially inflated insulin, elevated insulin, metabolic rate was significantly reduced. And then, like I said, David Ludwig did this in humans. look by giving them meals that would spike their insulin or wouldn't, and seeing these a change in metabolic rate to the tune of about 300 calories per day.
Mm-hmm. Okay, guys, I guess that's going to do it. You can find him on YouTube, too. He has a lot of good talks on YouTube if you're looking for more of this stuff. I saw you've been doing a lot of interviews lately, too, which is really cool. The book, Why We Get Sick. And then he also, if you want to talk about this for a minute, we have, wait, where is it? Health Code, which is you got like a little meal replacement supplement here. And we actually have a coupon code for this too, guys. It's, what was it again?
Yep, KC10.
KC10. And we tried this on a product review video probably about 4 months ago. Really good stuff. Right. Good ingredients. You know, none of like the vegetable oils or anything like that. Do you want to just talk about it real quick? What's in it? What's it for?
Sure. Yeah, glad to. Yeah. So honestly, although this is upsetting to some when they see a scientist venture into entrepreneurial efforts, but when you think you have answers to relevant questions, like I think I do, you can't help but want to provide solutions to problems. And one of the beauties of going on a low carb diet is you got to eat more real food. That is a wonderful thing. It's also a burden, a hurdle where you've got to plan and prepare these meals. So the health code shake is really just an effort to make low carb easy. So it's high protein, high fat into 1-to-1 ratio with pre and probiotics, apple cider vinegar, and a few other things that I wanted to sprinkle in. Anyone who wants to learn more about it, please go to gethealth.com. And by all means, please use the KC10 coupon code at checkout. I'm also providing blog posts there so people can read up on some interesting science. Like I just published a blog post looking at this expression of an enzyme on fat cells that basically when people adhere to a very low calorie diet, the fat cells become 12 times better at pulling in fat to store. So the fat cells become like 12 times hungrier for fat when someone's losing weight through a very low calorie diet. So, and insulin, of course, controls that process totally. So anyway, go there for cool blog articles and get the shake. I'm pretty sure it'll be the best low carb meal replacement shake anyone's ever had.
Yeah, it looks like you did a little photo shoot here for the blog post thumbnails too.
Yeah, those were family photos, Matt. Yeah. So they just gotta have a face on these, you know. Some people, hey, Matt, some people think bald, freckled guys are handsome. And I married the one girl who thought that. Nice. So it's not really a sales item. We need to put a new face on there.
Yeah. So where can the people find you? I realize I just kind of delved into this. The science guys that are talking about keto and insulin and all this, they're big on Twitter. I didn't realize this. So you're a big guy on Twitter. I see you have a big Twitter following.
Yeah. So that's where I started, Matt, and I don't regret it because it gave me a lot of great connections. But I find Twitter to just be unpleasant, to be honest, for lack of a better word. Not that I'm thin-skinned.
Getting unpleasant eventually.
Yeah, and so I've really migrated more to almost totally on Instagram. So about once a week, I try to make a little video, a short little snippet about human metabolic health. It's never anything useless. It's never me posing, never me working out. It's never me doing something with my family. It's just me sharing some insight into human metabolism. So find me on Instagram, and that's Ben Bikman, PhD. And also, to get blog updates, go to also follow Get Health. Remember, it's HLTH, and that's where we'll announce whenever I do a new blog post.
Awesome. And then anything else you're working on? Any new stuff you want people to know about?
Yeah. The book, The Shake, Insulin IQ is an online coaching platform that people can check out as well that I helped create. It's a wonderful effort, and we're working with Diet Doctor there. Anyway, more of my desire to provide solutions to problems.
Yeah, I like this idea because I was watching one of your talks, and doctors and scientists, they take so much pride in the disclosure slide when they're like, no disclosures.
I know.
And then I saw yours and it was like, I'm starting a health food company. I have a book. I get royalties from the book. And it's just like, that's fine too. Like, I think it's even better if your message is like financially viable and it can actually compete out there with all these other ideas. I like that.
Well, I hope, fingers crossed. You help me make it financially viable, everybody.
Yeah, and as far as Twitter versus other social medias, you definitely have the talking down, the video quality. I feel like you should just get on YouTube more.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to do that, Matt. I don't know how. That's too
It has to
daunting.
be something where you're talking, because I think the text, it really reduces what you are
Oh, I totally
down.
agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, but that's going to do it for today, guys. We got another interview tomorrow at 11:15, same time. We're going to be doing more of these just because I got my setup going now, and it's kind of easy to just fire these off quickly and get people's messages out there. So thanks so much for joining us. Check out Ben on Instagram. Get the book. You can get it on Amazon. It's also linked in the description of this video. And